Teaching and learning with Mr. Miller. Today we're going to be looking at representation, which is part 3 of the macro elements of media studies analysis. Now part 1 is genre and part 2 is narrative. Now we've already covered part 1 and part 2, that's genre and narrative, in other videos, so this will be the third one. So my recommendation would be to watch genre, narrative, and then this one, representation. I'll link the other videos in the description if you need it. Might even pop them up at the top there so you can click on those if you want to. So the idea would be when you're analysing a media text, whether that be a film, whether that be a TV show, newspaper, magazine, document, whatever it is that you're analysing, you would analyse the genre, the narrative, and representation, and those three things kind of work hand in hand. There's also the micro elements as well, which might be things like mise-en-scène, cinematography or camera and editing and sound, and lots of other things as well. And I'll probably be making some videos on those as well. Because the micro elements do hugely affect the macro elements and vice versa. But for today we're just looking at representation and what we mean by representation in a media studies sense. Now this is going to be relevant for GCSE Media Studies, A-level Media Studies. It's probably also going to be quite useful if you're looking at film studies, maybe you're doing IB film, and even the BTEC courses as well, the more vocational ones, when you're actually going to be creating some of these media text, and maybe you need to consider how you are representing information and how you are representing people. So we'll dive straight in, and the theory that I'm going to be talking about is actually one from a guy called Stuart Hall, who is a British media theorist. He talks about there being two definitions of representation. So if you do want to get a little bit more information from this, you might actually want to go and check out some of Stuart Hall's stuff. Be aware there are two British Stuart Halls. One is the black media theorist. The other one, a white guy, is a convicted paedophile. Make sure you get the right one, otherwise you're going to be reading some unusual literature. So he talks about two definitions of representation, and the first definition of representation that he talks about is the idea of representation. I mean, the word representation, you can see, is made up of the word representation or represent. The image I'm using there in the background, a famous painting, some of you may know, and what it says in French underneath is it says, "This is not a pipe," and this is the whole idea of representation. I don't think that's exactly what the artist was going for necessarily, but in an artistic sense, in a media sense, it's very similar. Because he, with his painting, is saying this is not a pipe, that isn't a pipe that you can see there, that's a painting of a pipe. In fact, actually, that's a digital version of the painting of a pipe. The idea being is that is a representation. It looks very similar. In fact, you could argue it's an almost perfect representation, but it's not exactly the same. That's the same thing that we're going to be looking at whenever we look at a media text. We're going to be looking at how what we're seeing isn't the information, it's the representation of the information. Because anytime that anything happens in the world, that information has been presented. It doesn't matter what that might be. That might be something incredibly relevant to your lives, maybe something like a war. That might be something like a crime. It might be something, doesn't always have to be bad, obviously, but it does seem that whenever we're working with media, or if there's any criticism of the media, it usually seems to be negative. Let's say a wedding then. Then the second that happens, that information has been presented out into the world. What the media does is the media produces media texts, whether that be a film, whether that be a TV show, newspaper, magazine, whatever it is, and it's representing that information to you. Now the problem with this, or the potential problem, is when it does take this information and represent it, it often does it in a way which is going to be truthful, or sometimes it's non-truthful. I suppose the best way of looking at it is, look at it like a scale. On one side, you've got the media is representing this information that happened in the world 100% accurately, which I would argue is borderline impossible, if not actually impossible. I don't think the media is able to represent any information with no bias, with all the information completely factually true. But the idea is that the job of the media, especially things like newspapers, which is supposed to be reporting things truthfully, their job is to report things as close to 100% as they can. 100% truthful. So a newspaper, a journalist's job, or the editor of a newspaper as well, because you could argue the burden falls on them, is that they are trying to represent the information as truthfully as possible. Now, I'm pretty sure that everybody can think of an example where maybe a celebrity has filed defamation against the newspaper because the information they've given isn't true. So the information they have represented isn't actually isn't actually close to the truth. It's a false representation. On the other side, of trying to be truthful, you have got some that try to completely be untruthful, say the opposite of what happened, representing completely opposite, and that's not necessarily always a bad thing. The example I've got there, as you can see at the bottom, is of the 1995 Academy Award-winning film Braveheart, directed by Mel Gibson. Now, if you don't know what Braveheart is, it's the story of William Wallace and him fighting a war. Arguably, the English were fighting a war with him, and he is defending himself, his country, his people. Now, when the film came out, it was praised by critics. It was fantastic. But then a lot of historians came out and said, this information that you've put in there isn't completely truthful. They were saying, in not so many words, Braveheart is representing information falsely. They were saying William Wallace wasn't actually a particularly heroic character. There were many things about the individual which were not so not so positive. Now, obviously, the filmmakers, when they came out, they said, well, we weren't trying to represent the information 100% truthfully. It's a film. They're taking what's called poetic license with it, where you're representing in a bit more of a Hollywood, a bit more of a cinematic way. And I think that's what a lot of people forget, is when they're watching the media, it isn't a presentation of information, it is a representation of information. If you wanted to learn about the character William Wallace, and you wanted to learn about these events in history, it's probably best not to go for a Hollywood film, because they would, and I'm sure they would admit themselves, the filmmakers, they are not trying to represent that information as truthfully as possible. It would probably be better to go for a history book, which you would expect to try and be representing this information as accurately as possible. So it's important that as a media theorist or a media student, we go in with this analysis being aware that the information we're looking at, it isn't a presentation of information, it's a representation of information, and we have to be aware of the media producers' intentions when they are presenting it, or representing it, sorry. We have to say, are they trying to represent this information in a way which is truthful, or are they trying to represent it in a way which is not? We've also got to be aware that actually sometimes, even if you are trying to be completely truthful, sometimes you're not going to be. Sometimes it's difficult to be 100% truthful in your representation of information. Now, if you're going to be doing GCSE Media Studies or A-level Media Studies or film or anything like that, that's one thing that you're probably going to be asked a question on, and it's going to be a case of how are the media producers representing information. And there's a certain way that we can do that. We can do that by looking at the individuals, and we can look at that by looking at the narrative. We can look at that by looking at the micro elements as well, such as mise en scène, genre, editing and sound. But we'll get onto that a little bit in a minute. Now, I'm not going to play the trailer for Braveheart. You can look at that in your own time. I will link you up in the description. Don't worry, you'll have all the links. So now what we're looking at is still sticking with that first idea of representation and how it's a representation of information. We get this phrase, which might be a good word to use in there. Now, as always, don't try and just shoehorn or name drop any media terminology. You have to use it appropriately and you have to use it correctly. But I think mediation would be a good word to be using in your writing, in your analysis. And the idea of mediation, and you can probably see right there, it's got the word media in it. So it's going to be quite apt. And the idea is that when information is been presented, from it being presented to the media representing it, representation, it's being processed before it's being released. So let's say a crime happens, the journalists will go to the scene, they will investigate a little bit, they'll try and get some quotes, they'll sit down, they'll write it, they'll rewrite it, then the editor will probably tell them what to rewrite and what to change, and then it goes out into the press, and then it goes out into the public. So during that process, it's being mediated. And what we mean by that is the information results in maybe changing. In fact, I would argue that it's always going to be changed, even if it is 99% truthful. There's still that 1% which may not be completely truthful. That may be because of the journalist bias. That might be because of information being left out. If they're particularly inappropriate journalists, you could argue that's also information being non-information or false information being included. Maybe information is being changed. So all information is mediated by the media, whether that be a newspaper, which is a very common or a very easy example to talk about with representation, or even something like music videos, for example, where you're seeing, your favourite artist performing. They are mediating the information about themselves, saying something like the example I always use is Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift may be actually as nice as she appears in all of her music videos and interviews and press coverage and whatever she does, but regardless of that, her information is still being mediated. You can't help that. All information is mediated. Now, the problem with it being far removed from the truth, the problem with something going through the process and then being misreported with misinformation is it could end up being what's called propaganda. We're recently calling this fake news, which is a phrase that everyone likes to throw around as if it's a new idea. But the idea of misrepresentation, the idea of propaganda has been around for decades, for centuries, I would argue. And this is the idea of taking information that is truthful, the presentation, and representing it in a different way. If you're going to look at war, any sort of historical war, you're going to see a lot of propaganda, particularly in things like World War II with the Germans, and the Russian propaganda, Soviet propaganda is very common as well. And the idea is if someone lost a battle, then all you got to do is just make a news broadcast to the public saying we won the battle, and there you go. You've represented the information completely untruthful, and that's called propaganda. Again, you can call that fake news, which is a phrase that's being thrown around. I wouldn't recommend using the phrase fake news in any of your writing, because it's a little bit low level. Maybe something like propaganda might be better, but mediation is probably the word that you want to go for. Now, the second definition that Stuart Hall gives of representation is the idea of representatives. And this focuses a bit more on individuals, and the idea how literally every single individual in the world is a representative representing information. You are a representative of your demographic, whatever that demographic might be. Now, I'm not just talking about how all men are representatives of men and how women are all representatives of women, even though that's true, and that is part of the idea. But it does go much further than that. It gets a lot more complex. So the idea is that people judge others based upon the opinions that they form of the representatives, and it's similar to that of stereotypes. Now, stereotypes is a word that we can absolutely use. In fact, actually, it might come up in your exams. I know the AQA Media Studies exam very often uses the word stereotypes. I think a question is, why do media producers rely on stereotypes or use stereotypes? And we use them as media producers, so the people making the media, because it's very easy to put to advertise to certain individuals if we've already labelled them and already put them into a certain category. So the example I'm going to use here is a film made by Clint Eastwood in 2014 called American Sniper. Now, the film title has got the word American in it, so immediately we can kind of determine what sort of demographic we're looking at. We're looking at Americans in this example, but not just Americans. There are also lots of different demographics as well. We might be able to look at because the film is about a real-life American sniper. Now, when I say the film is about a real-life American sniper, the actual sniper, that's the information being presented. This film, American Sniper, Clint Eastwood is representing the information. I don't really know if it's truthfully done or not, but I think it's safe to say that we're looking at Americans, and it's all about him going to war in the Middle East. So we've also got the representation of Middle Easterners and Arabs, to be more specific, and I think Iraq and Afghanistan are going to be some of the countries that are going to pop up. Now, what happened after September 11th, 2001 is that the media very much tried to focus on these representatives of the Middle East, things like Arabs and things like Muslims. We could argue that they maybe didn't get the most positive of representation. The information about Muslims very much wasn't being represented as truthfully as many Muslims around the world wanted to see, which is completely understandable. And I think this film does somewhat do that. If you want to watch the trailer is actually quite a well-made trailer. It's a specific scene in the film. I'll link it in the description below. And you can see how this American sniper is very much being represented as a hero and not just a mindless soldier out to kill. It's also representing the Middle Easterners as being a bit ruthless, a bit a bit inhumane in many ways, and whilst this information that they're representing may be true in this context, unfortunately what it does is it shows them, these people, in a negative light as representatives. Therefore, what the audience are likely to do is they're going to form their opinion of this entire demographic, and that's millions and millions of people, and they're going to form their opinion of these millions and millions of people based upon these representatives. And if they're the only representatives that people have seen, then that's going to be maybe a harmful representation. So the second definition of representation is the idea of human beings acting as representatives, and these representatives are representing information around the world. So the important thing to do when you're looking at representation is to look at how is the information potentially being represented, because all information is being represented, and then look at how maybe the individuals within the media text are representing that. So if it's a newspaper, if they talk about any humans, which they most likely do, in fact I can't think of any articles I've ever read that don't talk about humans, then they are the representatives, but also the writer of the article is a representative. You can also look at like films and TV shows. They often have human characters in them. Again, I can't really think of any films or TV shows that don't have human characters, and you could argue things like, well, Disney when it's the animals, but again, those animals are actually more human than animal, I would argue, because they take on the human emotions and the human characteristics. And the idea is to look at how those representatives are representing information. Is it truthful? Is it not? Is it going to be affecting audiences in various ways? And the questions that you're probably going to get in your exams are going to say something along the lines of how is information being represented to an audience, or how are females being represented? How is race, ethnicity being represented? And your question will probably very much come down to looking at what demographic that the question is asking you. So it might be asking you gender and sex, so male and female. Obviously not looking to get into the discussion about how many genders there are, but it'll probably just say something along the lines of male or female. The question is probably going to be referring to sex more than gender. It might look at something like age. How are teenagers being represented? How are older people being represented? Race and ethnicity has always been a bit of a hot topic, so chances are the question will focus on that. And it might talk about maybe how Black, Asian, minority ethnicities are being represented. Sexuality does often come into it as well. I'm teaching in the United Arab Emirates here in Dubai, so we don't usually have too many kind of focuses on that for obvious reasons. National regional identity, so it's geographic as well, so it's like how different countries, so the West versus the East, Middle East, how might something be represented differently to those different audiences, including those different representatives. Ability and disability is something that I've seen popping up quite a lot in the last 10 years. And also you can look at psychographic if you want to get a little bit more higher level, talking about political, religious ideals. It might also just be talking about something like active and passive audiences, and the idea how an active audience might react to something differently than to a passive audience. Okay, we'll end that there. Like I said, that's part 3 of the media elements of, the macro elements of media analysis. My recommendation would be to go and watch the genre, narrative and representation all in a row to get yourself completely familiarized. I will also leave some questions in the description as well, so if you want to test yourself and see if you did get what you need from that, then you can answer those questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.